In 1986, a Nobel physicist sat at a presidential commission hearing on live television. He had a piece of rubber from the Challenger space shuttle solid rocket booster. He had a small C-clamp he had bought from a hardware store earlier that day, and he had a glass of ice water that for some reason the catering staff took forever to bring to him. When the ice water finally arrived, he didn't drink it. He tightened down the clamp on the piece of rubber, dropped it in the water, and then waited for the perfect moment. Then, on camera, on live TV, he loosened the clamp and showed the country that the rubber didn't spring back. That was the end of NASA's official explanation of the Challenger disaster. It was also, although nobody knew it at the time, one of the cleanest case studies of a failure pattern that is now the dominant security failure mode in tech. The failure isn't a technical one, it's a communication failure between the people who know how the system actually works and the people who decide whether it ships. Today I'm going to walk through what Feynman found, the line he wrote at the end of his report that you should know by heart, and why the exact same pattern is playing out right now in autonomous systems. Let's dive in. Richard Feynman was perhaps a strange person to put on a presidential commission. He was a theoretical physicist. He won the Nobel Prize in 1965 for quantum electrodynamics. He had worked on the Manhattan Project as a young man, and he played the bongo drums. He cracked the safes at Los Alamos for fun. He was famous for asking what sounded like dumb questions until the smart people in the room realized they didn't have the answers either. That's the Feynman the public knew. But there's a second Feynman that matters more for this story. He was a bit of a showman. He understood that a fact, presented at the right moment, in the right way, lands harder than the same fact in a 200-page report that nobody reads. And he was, despite his reputation, pretty politically savvy. The day he did the ice water demonstration, the general sitting next to him, General Catino, was coaching him on the timing. When Feynman first reached for his microphone to do the demo, General Catino grabbed his hand and whispered, "Not now." A few minutes later, Feynman reached for the microphone again. "Not now. Wait until the official is on the specific slide." Feynman waited patiently, and when the slide came up, he pressed the button. That moment didn't happen because a brilliant scientist couldn't help himself. It happened because a brilliant scientist and a smart general timed it together. Without that timing, the truth probably would have died in a footnote. But none of that demonstration would have happened if Feynman hadn't been in the room in the first place. And he almost wasn't. So the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch on January 28, 1986. 7 people died that day, including a high school teacher who had been chosen to be the first ordinary citizen in space. The country was watching live when it happened. I was watching it live from my classroom in school on TV that day. After the disaster, President Ronald Reagan appointed a presidential commission to investigate. It was chaired by William Rogers, a former Secretary of State under Nixon. Feynman was one of about a dozen commissioners. Most of the commissioners were senior executives, retired generals, and former government officials. Feynman did something none of the others did. He insisted on talking directly to the engineers who built the shuttle, not the managers or the program leads, the actual engineers. That was the strategy that made the rest of this story possible. Early in the investigation, Feynman wanted to know how the rubber O-rings in the booster joints behaved at low temperatures. The launch had happened on a cold morning, so the temperature mattered. He sent the question to NASA. The answer came back as what Feynman called a sandwich of memos. The top layer stated, "Professor Feynman wants to know about the O-rings." Each layer below it was a subordinate passing the question to another subordinate. At the bottom, finally a piece of paper with numbers. But the numbers answered the wrong question. He had asked how the rubber responded in milliseconds, the time scale of a launch. But the answer described how the rubber crept back over hours, so the response was useless. That's when Feynman stopped asking through proper channels. All right, the next morning, here's how the story rolls out. It's 8 a.m., Washington, D.C., and it's snowing outside. Feynman is standing outside a hardware store, dressed in a suit, patiently waiting for it to open. When it opens, he goes in and he buys screwdrivers, pliers, and the smallest C-clamp he can find. He takes them with him to NASA, and he pulls a sample of the booster joint rubber already staged for the day's hearing, and he waits. At the hearing, on camera, he asks for some ice water. But for some reason, it takes a really, really long time to arrive. Feynman gets a little anxious. What on earth could be taking so long? When it finally arrives, he doesn't drink it. He clamps the rubber and drops it in the water, and then waits. When his slide comes up, the one General Catino pointed out to him, he loosens the clamp. The rubber doesn't spring back. He calmly handed the piece of rubber to the person sitting next to him and then made the famous statement, "I believe that has some significance for our problem." That was perhaps the biggest understatement of the entire hearing. At 32 degrees, the seal had no resilience. That's the demonstration the country saw. But here's the part most people don't know. While he was investigating the O-rings, Feynman started asking a different question. What did NASA think the chance of catastrophic shuttle failure actually was? When he wrote it up in Appendix F, the range was stark. Working engineers across NASA put the probability of a catastrophic loss at roughly 1 in 200. NASA management claimed 1 in 100,000, a huge discrepancy between the people building the system and the people in charge of it. The clearest example came from the main engines developed at Marshall. Feynman asked the engineers who built those engineers to write down their estimate on paper. The most optimistic estimate was 1 in 300. He asked their manager. The manager refused to give a number. Instead, he wrote a paragraph about engineering judgment, past experience, and quality control. That phrase, engineering judgment, is doing a lot of work. It sounds technical, it sounds responsible, but what it actually means is we don't have to give you a number, just trust us. Feynman continued to push. The manager eventually said the probability of mission success was, quote, 100% minus epsilon. Feynman asked, what is epsilon? The answer was 10 to the negative 5. 1 in 100,000. So Feynman tried to make the number make sense out loud. Roughly 1 in 100,000 means you could fly the shuttle every day, 1 flight a day, for 300 years between accidents. That's not a number that a serious person who has actually looked at the engines would write down. It's a number that comes out the other end of a system that is unwilling to write down the real one, that's unwilling to grapple with the truth. That's the pattern Feynman documented. Engineers were screaming, in his words, help, this is a red alert. Well, management was quietly reducing criteria, accepting more and more errors, and keeping the launch schedule, until something broke. Feynman wrote up his observations as a personal appendix to the Roger Commission report. It's short. You can read it in about 15 minutes, but it's one of the most important pieces of writing about engineering culture that exists today. He almost didn't get it included. He had to fight for it. He threatened to have his name removed from the official report if the appendix wasn't included. He opens the appendix by stating plainly that the estimates for catastrophic failure range from roughly 1 in 100 to 1 in 100,000, and that the higher figures came from working engineers while the very low figures came from management. Then he asks the question that frames the entire document. What is the cause of management's fantastic faith in the machinery? He spends the rest of Appendix F answering that question. He describes what he saw at NASA as, in his words, an almost incredible lack of communication between the managers and their working engineers. He describes the way safety criteria get altered with arguments that sound logical until the system that was originally designed to be very safe is now flying in a relatively unsafe condition. And then at the very end, he writes this line. I'm going to read it to you slowly because I want you to hear it the way he wrote it. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. That is the line. It's the cleanest description I know of what is going wrong in security right now. So let me bring this home. Feynman documented 3 things at NASA. 1, the engineers knew about the problem. 2, management didn't want to hear about it, especially if it would delay the launch. 3, the criteria for what counted as safe got quietly reduced over time. That's the same pattern I've watched from the inside in multiple industries. And there's a documented public version of this in self-driving cars. I want to spend the rest of this video on that one because it's on the record and you can read the source material yourself. In 2019, a security research team called Tencent Keen Lab published a paper on Tesla's autopilot. They documented 3 findings. 1, they were able to fool the auto windshield wiper system into activating with adversarial images. 2, they were able to fool the lane recognition system into steering into a fake lane by placing small stickers on the road. The car drove into the opposing lane. 3, they were able to take over the steering system using a wireless gamepad even when autopilot was inactive. 3 different ways an attacker could manipulate or override an autonomous driving system. Now, I want you to read Tesla's responses as recorded by Keen Lab with Feynman's NASA in your head. On the auto wipers finding, the response was roughly this. This used an image on a TV in front of the windshield and is not a real-world situation. The feature is in beta. On the lane recognition finding, the one that potentially steers a Tesla into oncoming traffic, they said, the researchers adjusted the physical environment by placing tape on the road, and a driver can easily override autopilot at any time. On the steering finding, they said, the primary vulnerability was fixed by Tesla through a robust security update in 2017, and we have never seen a single customer ever affected. 3 responses and 3 patterns. Not a real-world situation, the driver can override, already patched, no customer affected. So read that last one again. We have never seen a customer ever affected. Feynman had a line that describes that line of thinking in Appendix F when he was talking about NASA's habit of treating O-ring erosion on previous flights as evidence of safety. He wrote, in summary, that when you're playing Russian roulette, the fact that the first shot got off safely is of little comfort for the next one. No customer ever affected is the same logic. The chamber just hasn't come up loaded yet. That's the modern version of engineering judgment. a verbal substitute for engaging with the finding. Now, I'm not going to claim Tesla didn't fix the issues. They probably did, but that's not the point. The point is the tone. The point is the response of a company that clearly does not want to hear about the problem. Now, let's take a look at the through line here. NASA management said 1 in 100,000 because they didn't want to hear engineers say 1 in 200. Tesla said the driver can override because they didn't want to engage with the researchers saying they hijacked the car. In both cases, it's defensible only because the system has not yet failed publicly enough to make the response indefensible. And that's the pattern your security team is dealing with right now. They surface real findings, they get back some version of not a real world situation, and they're burning out trying to be heard. Now, in my last videos, I gave you questions to take into your design reviews. Does this control still work when no human is watching? Does this control still work when the model has been compromised? Today, I want to give you one more. Does this control survive contact with the people who don't want to hear about problems? Because if your finding only lives in places management controls, they can erase it with a single statement. That's what Tesla did. That's what NASA did. The control that survives is the one that is in the architecture, in the test plan, in the regulators' filings, in the public record. Feynman understood that, and that's why he insisted on talking to the engineers. That's why he wrote Appendix F instead of trusting the main report to carry the message. That's why he timed the ice water demonstration for live television. He was building controls and crafting a message that didn't depend on management wanting to hear them. All right, so if you want the deeper version of this, you'll find it in my newsletter, The Product Security Playbook. Link is in the description. If you're new here, welcome. This channel covers product security from an insider's view, drones, AI agents, autonomous systems, and the patterns that connect them. If you don't want to miss the next one, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.